Thank you. Financial, technological difficulties here. I think I got them panned out. So we are here, History 101, and we're doing an argumentative piece on what may or may not have led to the Civil War. And as you guys may know, if you study, and I've only done so at a superficial level, but if you study fallacies, right? Breaks in logic. You know that sometimes you have something called correlation without causation, right? That sometimes you could have, you look at variables, let's say two people are in a soccer match or something, right? Two teams, and then you look at different variables as to who they chose as their players, what may have happened in the 48 hours leading up to the game that may have affected. Maybe a couple people got sick prior to the match. You look at a last minute change of strategy by one of the coaches. And just imagine four or five other variables that could have gone a different direction prior to that match, and one team wins, right? So then you look back in retrospect and say, okay, what were if I were to put it in a causational hierarchy, what was most influential, right, in causing this team to defeat that team in that soccer game, right? And it gets tough, it gets subjective, where that you can't really definitively prove your point, but you could certainly use evidence to support it, right? And of course you should, you got to be required to do such. So at any rate, the same thing with the Civil War. You have multiple changes that went on that could have gone in a different direction, and to what extent did can we create a hierarchy, if you will, on causation, and of course try to do our best to surmise where it was not merely correlation, right? Where yes, this happened just prior to the Civil War, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it helped cause it, right? As an extreme, right, of the fallacy of correlation without causation. What if someone said, well, you know what, I think it's because the one of the team had a lighter uniform and it was a hot day, or they wore a better, more comfortable cleat, right? Well, that may or may not have had anything to do with their success. They could have just correlated, right, that they happened to have that uniform or wearing those cleats, and they happened to have won, but it likely did not cause that outcome. So the same thing here is you bring your assumptions with you, right? So for instance, court historians, right? They like to do Whig history, right? WHIG, remember the Whig Party of England? They like to think, oftentimes the Whig historians, that society it was heading in a direction toward greater and greater freedom and autonomy for more individuals in that given society. So they thought they were hopeful, right, and anticipated that society would evolve toward democratization, more and more opportunities, freedoms, right, powers for the average person. Okay, so you see some Whig history when it comes to court history. Remember, court history, you praise the winners. So hence, we're going to praise the North, that the good guys won, if we were to adhere to court history, right? And so you could probably take an easy guess how this narrative is going to go, because you could think of Bernard Balin's book, and others who contend, right, that court historians who want to praise our winners and those who have established our institutions and culture, etc., right, and praising those winners, we like to adhere to American exceptionalism, right? That we are different, but in a superior manner, right? That we're a little bit better than the average nation, right? And so, hence, the average nation, for instance, right, has been largely led by material factors, economic self interest and competition, place for power, right? Desire for domination, self interest, right? There's nothing exceptional about that. There's nothing romantic about that. But with court history, right, an idea of American exceptionalism, we say, for instance, no, we are exceptionally, uniquely an idealistic nation. We're a nation of ideals, right? That whereby we don't see the world as it is, we see it as it ought to be, and we want to improve it, right? We want to change it for the better, and so we have some grand vision, right? Uh, 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 to which we want to adhere and bring the nation, right? Raise it up. So at any rate, that's where we're going here. So court history contends, right, that the Civil War was fought as a crusade, right, to end or not end, to fulfill, right, the promise of the founding fathers in their rhetoric, basically, right? Remember that rhetoric was largely tied to the Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening, uh, the um, the French Enlightenment for sure, the Scottish Enlightenment, English and Scottish libertarianism, right? All those things that they during the War for Independence, right? They pushed for human rights, the equality of all man. A lot of that rhetoric was very egalitarian. It put all human beings on equal footing. So we fought supposedly in court history to fulfill and finish that promise of the rhetoric of our founding fathers, right? And in so doing, right, we were largely abetted as a nation in fighting this crusade, beginning with a an exceptionally idealistic and courageous minority of reformers. All right, and I need you to know that or put that down for your, should you, write on this one, and also for the test. All right. So court history contends that there arose a unique generation that was idealistic and courageous. Caitlin, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna ask if you could repeat it.
Sure. So court history, right, contends that we fought a crusade to carry into fulfillment the promises of the founding fathers, right? Namely, that all men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. The government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, right? And so forth from that enlightenment that we've gone over back at the War for Independence in Bernard Bailyn's book, and that this largely was facilitated or brought about by a few factors. So one was the rise of an exceptional, idealistic, courageous generation of reformers, in particular, abolitionists who wanted to abolish slavery, right? And who were called the radicals within the Republican Party, the radical Republicans. That they constituted a small numerical minority, according to court historians, makes this thesis even sweeter, right? Because they went against the grain. They didn't do that which was popular, right? But they followed their conscience, even in the face of a very violent, um, sometimes literally violent, a very violent backlash against them. But they stood their ground. Some were, quote, martyred. Okay. So then after this, this courageous minority group, right? A small number amidst the population of that time period, right? While they rise and while they force, right? They put pressure upon the proponents of slavery to have discourse on slavery issue. They force it to a head. They force this issue, right? And the idea is that when you have a bully, when you have a grand injustice, it actually constitutes an act of courage uh, to start a fight with that bully, or at least to confront him and to force him, right, to mend his ways, to do something to change. So then, while this is happening, right, while there's agitation by this numerical minority, they're making a lot of noise. They're making people question things, right? They're making people they're having a polarizing effect. They tended to either have people, wholeheartedly promote them, support them, or absolutely anxiously oppose them, right? As troublemakers, as agitators, as they were oftentimes called. But whether you liked them or not, whether you agreed with their goals and methods or not, right? The idea was is they forced Americans to confront this issue, and they did so very courageously and tirelessly. Then, also tied to court history, right, is while they are doing this, the opening of the West in particular, right, from the Mexican American War of 1848, right, the opening of the West in particular is going to open up a can of worms whereby the new states, the new territories applying for statehood now in the far West are going to force Congress and successive presidents to confront the slavery issue. And thus will ensue uh, some very polarizing events in the 1850s alone. And very briefly, some examples of that. The Compromise of 1850, allowing California to be a free state, but having a fugitive slave law in quid pro quo fashion for the South. The Dred Scott case, right? The decision against a slave and his deceased former master and that former master's wife after they had moved up into free territory, Northwest Territory, and also a free state, right? And of course, he challenged the notion, tried to unsuccessfully, that slaves be recognized under law merely as chattel, right? As like agricultural property. And of course, it's going to largely fail. And you have quotes from people like Abraham Lincoln, who contended that the Dred Scott decision was so backward, it was so regressive and hostile that it encouraged people like himself to get back into politics and fight against that very movement of the Southern planter class to secure their property throughout the country. You also have the caning of Charles Sumner. Um, he and others like George Julian, Salmon Chase, Joshua Giddings. They were very courageous when they would get up in the Senate and in the House um, and give great speeches, just tearing into the institution of slavery, and in some cases into the Southern reps themselves. Well, Charles Sumner was almost beaten to death in the Senate chambers, and that had obviously a polarizing effect on North and South, right? Where it almost forces you to pick a side, if you will. Then you also have the Underground Railroad and the term Secret Six, the notion, right, that there were secretly six abolitionist um, senators who were funding and promoting um, Harriet Tubman's trips, right, into the South to free or liberate slaves. And remember the legal. Well, we're going to get to that very soon. Okay. You have also the what I thought was very pivotal subjectively is the Kansas episode, right? Because a guy named Stephen Douglas said, okay, right, here we are in a dilemma, in a predicament here. The Constitution, right, doesn't give us an explicit formula for when we acquire territories and as we incorporate them into states, can they have slavery? Who decides? You're not going to find that explicitly, at least, in the Constitution, right? Not to mention the Article 1, Section 8, giving Congress its special powers. Can you find anywhere in there whereby they can, that's enumerated or specifically stated, that they could interfere in slavery in Virginia and Alabama, where it's already sanctioned by a state um, government constitution? And that's a rhetorical question. You won't find it, right? And remember, we have a federal republic where the states share powers with the federal central government. So hence, right, like Amendment 10 states that whatever is not explicitly given to the federal government nor covered by the necessary and proper clause is reserved or left over for the states. So hence you have people like Abraham Lincoln who said, you know what, constitutionally, we can't do anything about slavery in the states where it's already sanctioned by their state government. He said, however, I believe there's a loophole in American political tradition to support the claim that the federal government can prevent slavery from spreading anywhere else into new territories. And of course, the obvious example that he used, right, were the Northwest Ordinances. As you may recall, Thomas Jefferson and members of the Confederation, they made a claim in these future states, later on Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Wisconsin, Minnesota. No problem, Madison. That in these states, as they will be carved out in the future, because at that point they were just formal territory, slavery can and will not be sanctioned there. So the government had done that before, right? But then, as far as an evolutionary process and us kind of following American political tradition in that way of being for moderate change and evolution, you had the Missouri Compromise of 1820, whereby they set a definitive line, right? Whereby in the future, slavery was to be okay south of that line, and it was to be prohibited north of that line. Well, there's plenty of evidence of that generation and the next not adhering to that or not wanting to adhere to that. So at any rate, it was a complicated issue. Oh, and then also you had some free soilers, as they were called, right? Who, unlike the Liberty Party and the Republican Party, they made it very clear they were not interested in the rights of African Americans. They were not really particularly motivated by, protective empathy for slaves. But they contended, right, that slavery was bad for poor whites indirectly. Jobs that could have gone to poor whites to allow them an avenue up the socioeconomic ladder, as for instance, sharecroppers, right? Instead, were being given to slaves. The white men, should they replace the slaves as sharecroppers, etc., the incentive system itself will ensure that they work harder, more diligently, and bring about better, more effective, efficient labor for the simple reason that they're working for something, right? Whereas the slaves have no incentive. So hence that slavery is it's inefficient, right? Economically. It doesn't promote diversification. It doesn't promote or give promises of socioeconomic ascension or mobility, right? And so hence you're not going to get good, honest work from anybody who doesn't have a personal incentive and hope or goal to rise up. So you could oppose slavery for the wrong reasons also. Okay. So at any rate, going back to this issue, Stephen Douglas said, I have an idea. How about we allow the people in the territory itself, right? In this case, Kansas and Nebraska, because we're beginning works of a transcontinental railroad. So we know that those territories are going to soon fill up with enough people to petition for statehood status, right? And become incorporated, annexed as new states. So he says, let's let the people decide. And they actually had like a referendum, like a popular vote. Well, both sides flooded immigrants in just to vote, right? They stuffed the ballot boxes. Both sides contended that they won. Both sides contended that the other side cheated. Both sides refused to step down, both claiming that they were the legitimate winner of that election. So the president in this narrative, right, steps in and he wants no part of it. The beginning of it was Franklin Pierce. Then it'll be James Buchanan. So at any rate, they kind of take a cowardly stand, and eventually the pro-slave side wins, uh, pretty much by a combination of lobbyist power to the federal government to be recognized as the winner, and also military might. Well, the anti-slavery side refuses to step down even still, and literally Kansas devolved into a civil war known as Bleeding Kansas. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, allowing the people in those territories to democratically decide themselves on the issue of slavery before they became a state, did not work. It resulted literally in a mini civil war. So you see, there are many occurrences that had a polarizing effect in the 1850s. Uh, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, makes a Christ-like martyr out of her fictional character, Uncle Tom, right? Who does nothing but continually endure mistreatment and reciprocate it with kindness and obedience and deference. And in the end, takes the fall for some fellow rebellious slaves and takes the punishment that they deserved rather than he does, right? And as he's being severely punished, um, he forgives his cruel um, overseer Simon Legree. So at any rate, that was a heartbreaking novel. You had lyceums, Lyceum. Lyceums were like intellectual fairs, right? The Chautauqua movement was huge, whereby people could go pay a nominal fee and hear one expert after another in a myriad of fields speak to the crowd. So it was meant to be intellectually enriching, right? Especially as college still was not becoming, universally relevant and available to that generation in the antebellum or before the war generation. So at the lyceums, right, abolitionists use those as platforms to get their word out. So you have people like Frederick Douglass, an ex-slave runaway, right, from Maryland, who has incredible stories that were just heart-wrenching and rendered the people in the audience literally weeping with stories of how awful slavery was before his very eyes. You have stories of the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, who had run away from South Carolina. Their father was a well-to-do, abusive, slave-owning planter, and they told the story of slavery and all its ugliness from where they had come. Okay. And so the list goes on of these polarizing events that happen in the 1850s, right? And so then the last part of this kind of Whig or court history of the Civil War is found in the timely evolution of Abraham Lincoln himself. You could do it, for instance, not only through action, but also through his actual written and spoken word. You could, if you want, construct a somewhat neat evolutionary chart from being almost somewhat indifferent to slavery to becoming something at least approximating a radical Republican abolitionist by the time he was killed. All right. So you could find evidence of this in his political campaign and the biography that was written at the time. You have contentions from himself that he was originally indifferent towards slavery. Then he gradually began to take a stand for abolitionists and their First Amendment rights. Then he took on, when he became a congressman and left state politics from, at just the state level in Illinois, he took the stand that the founding fathers intended slavery to eventually die out. That was their original intention. And so, hence, for him, the best way of ensuring its demise is to choke and strangle it in the east and not allow it to move to the west. But again, he personally doesn't want to move it to the west. But who has jurisdiction to decide that, right? He argued, right, in particular, Congress, as the Continental Congress or the Confederate Congress had decided unilaterally in the past that the Ohio Valley could not have slaves. So then he was cornered in a famous debate by Stephen Douglas, who said, "What if everybody in Kansas or Nebraska were to decide to have slavery? Would you, as a senator in your small elite branch of senators, would you unilaterally decide no and overturn the will of the people of Kansas?" And he took the stand finally and said, "Yes, I would. I'd overturn their decision." Firstly, he contended, we have a republic, not a democracy. And so hence we don't have to, and we ought not to uh, make decisions on something as volatile as slavery by popular will, right? Secondly, he contends that slavery is inherently immoral. And you think, of course, hello, right? But that was a very brave stance to take in his generation. We'll get into in a moment other ways that you could take on slavery that were a lot, quote, safer. And so hence, right, it was so immoral that it required a special decision by Congress to unilaterally decide to not allow it in any of the new states taken from Mexico, etc., and from the Louisiana Purchase. Then, of course, as the war goes on, no problem. As the war goes on, he becomes more adamantly willing for the Washington, D.C. government, he and Congress, right, to take slaves away where it's already established by state law and where the Constitution did not say he had the power to do that. And of course, what were the culminating, results of that? The Confiscation Acts. We'll get into that more in the future during the war, and in particular, the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So the argument is Abraham Lincoln, in court history anyway, that he progressively gained more empathy for the plight of slaves, more of a sense of a crusader's sense of noblesse oblige, right? The nobleman's obligation to help those who need it, who are powerless. So at any rate, that's what we have with court history. So the first thing I try to do putting this number together is to try to provide evidence to convince you that this was not an average generation, this antebellum before the war generation. So you see all these reform movements that erupted, right? Benevolent societies just exploded during the antebellum period. And you had some as generically named as Commission for the Suppression of Vice. That's pretty generic, right? We're going to take on and suppress vices of any sort. So they ranged all along the spectrum, against alcoholism, against spousal and child abuse, for treating prison inmates and the psychologically impaired better and recuperating them rather than punishing them. You had movements against criminal activity in the growing cities, right? You had a movement for church and Sunday school. for to believe it or not, to be made even mandatory in some cases, which didn't work. You had a movement for public school system for all young kids, especially males, to be entitled to a basic education everywhere. You had a movement for better health. You look up Sylvester Graham. By the way, if you want to look into the treatment of inmates, look up Dorothy Dix, DYX. Very interesting. You also had unique American responses to the changes of the antebellum period, right? We were blowing up population wise. We were spreading westwardly demographic wise. We were beginning uh, to displace home production with mill production, right? With producing goods at a mill, at an early pre-factory, rather than at a given farm. And so hence you're beginning to displace artisans, skilled workers who made their product by handcraft, with the beginnings of machine wrought production, right? And it'll take a full 100 years to really get assembly line, interchangeable part oriented mass production to really get moving. But you arguably have the beginnings of that now. Commerce or trade connecting connecting from one region to the next through development of infrastructure, canals, turnpikes, of course, railroads gave an incentive for people to trade from one region to the next, and also a growing trade internationally through ports like Philadelphia and New York City and Boston. So there were changes that were going on. Supposedly, there were changes in the average income and disposable income of the average person, that the standard of living, especially in the North, was increasing. You also had immigration in pretty large numbers, particularly from the German 39 states and from Ireland, and all the issues that are going to come from that, including a nativist reaction known as the Know Nothing group, right? The Know Nothing Party, trying to restrict immigration, particularly of Irish Catholics. So you have a lot of flux supposedly going on. So, of course, the reasons for which this idealistic generation went to great lengths in reforming benevolent societies, attacking different vices, which, of course, you guys included women's rights and anti slavery or abolition of slavery, right? They could have been afraid of the changes that were going on. They could have becoming better well off, kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and had their basic necessities taken care of, because a lot of reformers were kind of well-to-do middle class, at least the leaders of these reforms. So they had money and leisure, they had education, and hence their basic needs were met. So now they could go, at a higher level of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs and try to improve their society. Some people more cynically think that they were trying to utilize social control, that inherently human beings might be averse to change. They didn't like the changes. They were anxious about them. And so hence, by leading these reforms, and contended that they wanted Americans to embrace middle class values, that they basically were trying uh, to to mold the institutions, the values, and the individual behavior of their generation of Americans into their own mold. So as a form of control, right? You have that more cynical outlook. You also have the notion of optimism, of evangelical and humanistic optimism that you see during the antebellum period. You have the Second Great Awakening, Charles Finney, and others, right? It's particularly the Methodists and the Baptists are going to give a sense of optimism with their revivals, that any human being can choose to become saved and accept Jesus Christ as his or her Lord and Savior, because remember they'd come from the Calvinists and Presbyterians who largely were predestined, right? Predestination adherents. And so now they believed in almost a human perfectibility, that especially if you've been born again, that you could be sanctified, you could be made like Jesus, and how you act and the contents of your soul and personality, right here on earth, not just on in the next world. A lot of them believed in the millennial reign of Christ from the book of Revelations, and Christ coming back to earth and fighting against the devil and reigning for 1,000 years here on earth, right? You literally have a lot of rhetoric about that, and belief that by cleaning up people's behavior, by preaching the gospel to all corners of the world, that they could hasten Jesus' second coming through good behavior. So you have a lot of optimism. Of course, you find that optimism in the utopian movements. The utopia, right? Literally meaning no place, because it's too good to be true. They tried to pretty much form, right, heaven on earth, if you will. Some were motivated by like German pietism and evangelical Christianity. And some were motivated more by purely secular sources, like Charles Fourier, who was like a pre-socialist from Europe, and wrote about promoting these phalanx columns, as he called them, or communes. So at any rate, you could look up Brook Farm, Oneida, New Harmony. They're fascinating, you guys. You also have, right, our own American philosophical answer to the romanticism that's going on in Europe, the Romantic movement. And it's known as Transcendentalism. And of course, its spokesmen were Emerson, right? Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. And remember, their notion was, right, when I think of like with Emerson in particular, do not defer to tradition. Just because tradition told you to do things this way or that way doesn't mean that it's infallible and ought to be followed. Experience, right? Experience, introspective thought, reading and education, those ought to lead you as far as your epistemology, the manner by which you come to accept things as true or false, right? Henry David Thoreau was huge on there ought to be no coercion whatsoever. Kind of going back to natural rights of our founding fathers, right? That all human beings were created to be optimally free. And there should be no coercive institutions that tell you how to think, how to act, how to behave, etc. Right? So some of them, you guys, some of the transcendentalists, some of the German pietists and utopian followers of Charles Fourier, some of them even went so far as actual anarchy, right? Where they thought we don't recognize any institutions made by man, because all institutions, they believed, have been corrupted. Okay. So that sense of, kind of a nonviolent civil disobedience, right? Thoreau predated Martin Luther King Jr. on that. All right. You also had our own religious denomination, right? In the form of the Mormon Church of Latter-day Saints. That's going to happen in this antebellum period, beginning in Western New York in the 1820s. And so, right, with Joseph Smith, his claimed epiphany with the angel, I'm going to butcher this, Moroni, supposedly getting these golden tablets through this epiphany with God, whereby at the fall of Jerusalem, and I can't remember my biblical history if it was the Assyrians, I think it was the Babylonians, when Jerusalem fell and the tribes of Israel scattered, that a couple of those tribes became lost and somehow made their way to the Americas, and that they lived amongst the Native Americans here at an early date. And then, of course, some try to tie that into the mystery of the Adena people, Adena, who were seen as being very culturally impressive with what they devised and seen as, quote, other, um, down to their lighter skin, according to accounts from other tribes along the Mississippi River. So, at any rate, right, you're going to get a lot of persecution towards Joseph Smith, who himself was murdered by an angry mob. Brigham Young is going to cut a deal with the government, bring forth a Mormon battalion to fight in the Mexican-American War in return for a refuge whereby they could start their colony known as Desiree, right, in Utah. And so, you have that going on as well as far as this exceptional generation during the antebellum period. So what did the Republicans do to rock the boat? So remember, they flooded the South with anti-slavery literature. They spoke at these lyceums and used the press to get their word out disproportionate to their small numbers. In addition to the written and spoken word, they tried to encourage petitions to Congress. So signature petitions became big, right? Getting thousands and thousands of signatures, demanding that Congress abolish slavery or do this or that, right? Public rallies and speeches became somewhat ubiquitous at this time period, right? Included, right, the use of women like Sojourner Truth and the Grimke sisters to go on speaking tours, etc., which was seen as, right, innovative by its proponents and seen as scandalous by its opponents. And then, of course, you also have a more confrontational, less compromising MO, right? Like modus operandi, how you go about doing things, carried out by this new generation of Republicans in Congress. So let me just throw a few names at you, and you could feel free to look at these names and study some of them on your own time. Although I like to think I have some decent information in your handout on it. Eric Foner, Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men. This is a great book. He's very respected as an historian on this topic, right? Let's see here. Other books that I'm using, by the way, for this topic, Creating a Culture of Reform in Antebellum America by Gregory Garvey, Cosmos Crumbling by Robert Obzug. This one's great. Ronald Walters, American Reformers, as is this one. Stephen Mintz, Moralists and Modernizers. All right. So you could find a lot of evidence, a lot of detail on American reform, making the argument, right, that this was an exceptional generation with lots of different reforms that sprung up. And then this one in particular, right, does a fine job of showing how Republican politicians, remember, a lot of the abolitionists, like William Lloyd Garrison, right, they proudly stayed out of politics. They wanted to use moral persuasion, right? That politics would require compromises that they were not willing to concede. But others, right, who did join politics and try to change it from within, this covers them pretty darn well, in my humble opinion. So, for instance, right, Joshua Giddings, Giddings. Look up his, his what's it called? American Infidelity speech that he made in Congress. That really was provocative to the Southern reps there present, and also his and another gentleman's appeal of the independent Democrats, trying to win over, right, the Southern white Democrats to the Republican Party by contending, right, that your slave-owning planter class does not respect you, they don't have your best interest in mind, and that their use of slavery is indirectly harming you, the common white Southern voters. So as he did that, as another guy named Salmon Chase chase, like the fish, spelt like the fish salmon. They engaged in propaganda, speeches, right, whereby they again, were arguably in the minds of the planter class, were fomenting class warfare down in the South by getting the common white people to rise up against the wealthy aristocratic planter class, right? So that's something to think about. You had other names out there. I mean, you have Wendell Davis, uh, um, um, or no, Benjamin Davis, Wendell Phillips, um, George Julian was a big one. William Seward was a big one, right? It's a decent list. I have them on number one. Okay. So does anybody have any questions on number one? All right. Number two does a 180. And number two contends, right? This war was not fought over slavery. It was not a moral crusade. So how do they go about doing that? Is one, right? They try to impugn the motives of the leaders of that generation, try to contend that they had ulterior motives. So, for instance, right, look up the Wilmot Proviso, Wilmot, and then Proviso, Proviso. David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, I believe it is, made a movement in Congress before the Mexican-American War was over that slavery be abolished in all the new territory conquered from Mexico, that it not even be an option in these new far western states. Well, literally erupted with fights, right? But what's interesting and sobering is you didn't have a lot of discourse during their debates and arguments on whether slavery is immoral or not. Sure, Rudy. But instead, right, they seem to suggest that they had things like power more on their minds. So, for instance, the faction thesis, right? The idea is going back to James Madison, and I'm sure even before him in the Federalist Papers, what you do for a living is largely going to influence your political platform and goals, right? Basically, your self-interest. That we as human beings are primarily selfish, and there's no getting around that. Okay, the whole notions of original sin withstood the Enlightenment. Okay, and so hence, being sinful as you are, right, you're going to likely become, whether you know it or not, whether you intended it or not, you're likely going to become a factional ally to other people who do the same thing you do. For the very simple reason is that you have the same selfish interest. What's good for you is good for him. So hence, right, I think you know where I'm going with this. If you move to the far west, and if it's made in the image of the South, and they have cash crop crops of cotton, etc., right? And they utilize slave labor. When one issue after another comes up in Congress, right? Those gentlemen, those slave-owning cotton planters in New Mexico, they're not even going to need to be courted, right, to try to be induced to become an ally. Just in following their own selfish passions, right, and interest, they're going to vote the same as the Alabama ones and Georgia ones, etc. So hence, right, to what extent was the Civil War in that taking the far west bit us in the rear? It forced us to confront the slavery issue, which was always very tentative, right, very precarious, and trying to keep compromise. So now the far west opens, right, and the idea is, according to more cynical revisionist thesis, is who is the West will be made in whose image? conflict history, right? Winners and losers. So that the northern bourgeois factions up in the north, they want the West to be made in their image. The southern planters, of course, want the West to be made in their own. For the simple reason is they want allies in the West who will vote along the same lines as they will. And not to mention, it increases, what would become the hub, the center of the wheel, right, of our economy, because you're already beginning to face that dichotomy by the Civil War of primarily northern states embracing the beginnings of mass production, factory work, urban migration, right? The bourgeoisie, the people of the city, sprouting out and developing their definitive classes, right? A middle management class, for instance, with the factories. And then the South, right, with its planters and slaves, sharecroppers, etc. So at any rate, others look with number two and say, dude, look how much racism existed in the North. What is it? 5 out of 19 northern states gave some citizenship to some African Americans. They're certainly not practicing what they preach, right? Radical Republicans who ran for office and stated that slavery is immoral and it is and ought to be eliminated even in the states where it already exists, who took that bold stand. William Seward, John C. Fremont. How did they fare, even just in northern states in the presidential elections? They didn't even get close. They got annihilated. So hence Lincoln, right, looked much more moderate when he ran. Said, hey, I don't believe I can do anything with slavery even if I wanted to in the states where it already exists. I just believe that there is a precedent in the past for us to prevent it from spreading anywhere else, right? So desperation, right? During the war, it took the Northern Congress and President Lincoln a long time to begin making any type of legislation that helped slaves or African Americans for that matter, right? But when did they finally do it? I mean, when they first started doing it, it looked as if it was punitive. Look up the language of the Confiscation Acts. And on a technicality, it declares that slaves are chattel property. And so hence, at that time, they were not treating the Southern fighters as combatants, as their own separate nation, because they didn't recognize them as anything but Americans who were rebelling, right? So for a while, the American government recognized this as an internal rebellion and not a war between two actual belligerent countries. And so in doing that, right, they contended that they had a right to punish treason in fighting against the government, right, and being taken as a prisoner of war by confiscating your property. So like I said, the confiscation acts are fascinating to me. You look at people like Benjamin Butler, who implemented those acts on the field as a military commander for the North. You don't see any idealism, much empathy. He was oftentimes annoyed by the slaves that he had confiscated, wanted them to do the dirty work that no one else did, dig the latrines, cook the food. They certainly didn't trust them to fight. And certainly if they did, eventually, it was only under a white commander, right? But what do you know, right? Is 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was out, arguably, President Lincoln was able to kind of test the winds. He could see, right? There were at least 3 confiscation acts. He could see what the response to those were, right? He had a guy named John C. Fremont who declared the slaves free in his area of conquest in Tennessee. Kentucky residents came to Lincoln and said, are you allowing your commanders to free the slaves? Because if you are, we're going to join forces with the South, with the 11 states of the Confederacy. Lincoln says, no, please don't do that. I promise you a deal. You can keep your slaves if you stay loyal to the Union and fight with and for me. and he ordered the slaves returned to their masters, and John C. Fremont moved from command. Yikes, right? When he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, before doing such, he made it clear to Seward and other members of the cabinet he only wanted to do it in a moment of strength after we had won a pivotal battle, right? Because he didn't want the country to see through the fact that the Emancipation Proclamation declaring slaves free, right, was arguably an act of desperation. And the whole idea is, right, with desperation, you look at the military components, facets to the war, and it does kind of carry out like a Rocky movie, right? The South won most of the major battles throughout the first two of the 4-year war of the Civil War. And only, by about 1863 did things begin to turn around for the North, arguably. So there's evidence that we really were somewhat desperate economically, militarily. And then also, well, anyway, that's all something to think about, because revisionists contend the North was indifferent about slavery. The abolitionists and others were a tiny, tiny minority that were not spokesmen nor representatives of the North, right? The North was more tied, as well as the South, to the faction thesis. They didn't want slave labor in the West so they could promise free wages to their voters in the East. And they could have a safety valve in the West and send those who were ambitious but not doing too well in the East. They could have free labor and jobs in the West instead of staying there and becoming rebellious. So that the North had ulterior motives. And that the fight was namely just to force the 11 states of the South to stay in the Union against their will, not to free slavery. But that as time came on, and as the casualties mounted, and the desperation mounted, and the ugliness of the fighting increased, that supposedly it became increasingly attractive to a lot of kind of Machiavellian military and political leaders of the North that they needed to step up the nastiness of this war. So you have more evidence by the end of the war of total warfare, bombing entire cities, starving them, Vicksburg, right? Atlanta, and getting more ruthless in the fighting. But also, right, there's a famous speech by George Julian, and he stated, I have stated time and again here in the Senate that we ought to free the slaves and to allow them to volunteer to fight with us, right? And I've given humanitarian and idealistic reasons for doing such, and those appeals have fallen on deaf ears. So he says, now I'm going to appeal to your self-interest. He said the South issued a draft before we did. The South began using their African Americans behind the scenes, following the armies before we did, right? And he named about 3 or 4 other examples. And he says, if we don't beat them to the punch, the South will use slave soldiers rather than us. All right, Madison. All right. And not to mention, you have a quote from Ulysses Grant and from Lincoln contending, just imagine how scared the white South will be if they saw 500,000, quote, Negro soldiers marching down the Mississippi. And not to mention the divide and conquer facet to all this, right? That this would embolden the slaves to defy their masters and to run away and join this army, etc., right? So that it would have a divide and conquer effect as well. So that they needed the African slaves. They loved to use it as a psychological, a tool of weakening and dividing the white South, right? So at any rate, that's something to think about. Okay. So with number two, it's generically revisionist. It revises, it challenges that rose-colored court or Whig history that you read about on number one. All right. So any questions? Let me get all your names, okay?
So we're supposed to do 2 for this week, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah, they're only two sections. So this time I do, if you don't mind, I asked you guys to do both of them.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If
You still there, Josh? I can't hear you. You didn't accidentally mute yourself, did you, Josh?
hello, wait, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure if this was asked already, but for the like the extra credit questions, do we have like if we had the chance to, are we allowed to choose like more than one question?
Oh gosh, you know what? I've never thought of that. Um, hmm. Yeah, you know what? Why not?
Okay, thank you.
Now, having said that, however, right? Um, I I think I definitely want to draw the line at two. Because someone could have virtually done nothing in the class all semester and do three of them and get 150 points, right?
Mm-hmm.
And totally compensate for not having done much during the semester. So yeah, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a qualified response to that. Sure, I'll take up to two if you're interested in doing two.
Okay, thank you.
No problem, Josh.
And when you stated that, like, quote, or the court history contends that we fought a crusade, the last part was a little fast and I didn't get to write the rest down.
No problem.
And letting me know what it is.
Sure, of course. Um, so remember, court history contends, right, that this was a moral crusade to finish what the founding fathers had begun. The founding fathers put in their rhetoric, all men are created equal, endowed with certain inalienable rights, right? All this great sounding, lofty rhetoric, but they didn't carry it through at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. That the Civil War was fought, right, to help fulfill that rhetoric, to actually implement it and put it into practice, say court historians. And it largely happened, right, thanks to a small number of reformers who were not your average run of the mill human beings nor Americans, right? But who made a lot of noise, went through great efforts to try to improve their world around them, right? And forced the country to look at the slavery issue, whether they wanted to or not, and have discourse on it. And then they were abetted in making this confrontation happen. They were helped or abetted by polarizing events that happened in the 1850s, right? Events that kind of made you pick a side because they were so dramatic, in nature. So we talked about, right, the caning of Charles Sumner, the Underground Railroad, the Missouri Compromise, the Dred Scott decision, the Lincoln Douglas debates. No problem, Joanna. Right? And these other events that had the Bleeding Kansas, right? And the Kansas Nebraska Act, et cetera, et cetera. So does that help?
Yes, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. All right. Anybody else?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So I know you're catching up on our grading, on grading our assignments.
Mhm.
So normally, like, we would get the grade and then we'd have your comments on it and be
Yeah.
able to fix what we did wrong in the next one. how will that work since we don't know, like, if we get a bad grade on one and we did something wrong and we did that on every single one because we didn't know?
I'll tell you what, Caitlin, if you don't mind, I'd like to propose a compromise, okay? Is a lot of you, just in many cases, right? I'm finding you are precisely fulfilling my criteria. You're citing exactly what the intended thesis was. You're giving at least one example of its support, right? And then you're giving me a reason for which you found it credible or not. So on those, if you don't mind, because I'm running behind, I just am, and I'm trying to play catch up. So what I'd like to propose as a compromise is if all of that is hit, very thoroughly, very well, just bam, that's exactly what I asked, right? As far as my criteria, I'm going to continue to just put a 50. But if I put something less than a 50, it's obviously because I found some fault with it. And how about then I will promise anything less than a 50 to write a comment on it.
Okay. So if we get something less than a 50 on one of the first assignments, but then we kept not meeting that criteria, would we just get less than a 50 on all of those, even though we
Oh,
didn't know?
no. I mean, yes. I mean, if you continue not to hit the criteria, absolutely. But yeah, especially the time periods that I'm doing this, the time lapse between the earliest ones and the last 3 or 4 that I've just caught up with. Um, I don't recall what you had gotten in the past, so I sure as heck don't label students. I have too many for that even to be practicable. But I don't label. You certainly, your whatever you got on the previous scores is irrespective of what I'm doing on the next one, right? I don't remember what I'd given you, and with all sincerity and not in the wrong way, I don't care because everyone deserves a clean slate every single assignment. But again, if you tend to be doing the same thing and having the same deficiencies and not hitting a certain criterion that I'm expecting, then it is rather likely that I'll continue to give you roughly that same grade, which will not be a 50. So by all means, I'll tell you what also helps me is, but like I said, I'm already committing right now. I can commit to this class that anything less than a 50, I could put a quick note on there as to why it was not given a 50. Okay, so keep that in mind right away. But also, what also helps me is, remind me on the assignment itself. It doesn't happen very often, but I love it when a student submits his or her assignment, and then down at the box where I'm to submit my responses between my written response, right, and above that the score that I put in is room for the student to have left me a message. And I love that when I'm reminded by the student, Mr. Cowell, I did my best here. What do you think about it? Could you tell me what this is missing or whatever? I always appreciate that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. All right, so anybody else? All right, guys, I'm gonna go ahead and call it a day. All right, in our case, right, call it a week. But yeah, look at that extra credit. I would highly recommend that you consider it, doing it, and just stay at it. Okay, guys, I'll continue to catch up on your assignments as far as grading goes. And thank you, both of you. Um, and remember also, as I put in the announcement, in the next day or two, I'm going to be putting multiple quizzes up under quizzes as well. And I'll try to make it very explicit on there when they are due. And as you could probably guess, I'm going to put most of them off and optimize your time to do them on your own schedule for the very simple reason that shame on me for not having posted them already. So like I said, I'm proud of that fact that any omission or mistake on my part, I always vow will not entail, any kind of punishment upon you as far as putting you under a time constraint or anything like that. All right. So thank you guys. We're going to go ahead and call it a day. Okay. Feel free to Canvas message me with any questions you have.
I have a question.
Yes.
How many quizzes are you gonna put up?
We're gonna need 5. Or no, it's 6, right? I need to look at the syllabus, Jaden. I'm gonna adhere to what the syllabus has. But I think it's 6.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. All right. All right. Bye-bye.